Good morning. Welcome to NRBP's Emergency Business Preparedness webinar. I'm Maya Curry. I'm the Vice President of Communications and Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at NRBP, and we're excited to host this program in collaboration with the New Jersey Business Action Center. Today's program will look at what an emergency business preparedness plan is, what it helps an organization to address, and why you should have one. And we're very excited to have Donald Newman, the NJBAC's Manager of Small Business Advocacy, here with us today to present the program. This program will be a presentation by Donald and will include brief Q&A at the end. There is a Q&A box in the Zoom where you can drop your questions, and we'll address those at the end. And we may address some during the program if they're relevant to a specific slide. This webinar will go over how you can recover from a disaster, how you can recover from a cybersecurity emergency, a personnel staffing emergency, and other significant types of emergencies that can impact the business. Donald serves as the Manager of Small Business Advocacy with the NJBAC, and he provides services to businesses of all sizes and all stages of development, from startup through maturity. He has over 17 years of experience as a business advocate and has assisted countless businesses to grow and prosper in New Jersey. I'm going to pass it over to Donald now to talk a little bit more about what the BAC does and to get into his presentation.
Thank you very much. You need to stop sharing so I can share mine slide. As Maya said, first of all, I'm going to thank the partnership, the business partnership, and specifically Maya, for inviting me to present to you today. So I'm going to be talking about business continuity planning and emergency preparedness. But first, I want to just tell you a little bit about who the Business Action Center is, that you know how we can provide services through a variety of different things that we can talk to you about. We are part of the Secretary of State's office, who is led by Lieutenant Governor Taisha Way, and our Executive Director, Melanie Willoughby. So that's my shout out to the senior people in our office. But our mission is to assist businesses, provide them with resources through technical assistance and financing, becoming exporters, government procurement, and in this case, learning a little bit about business continuity planning. I am not I have a lot of different specialties, so we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through. Here we have a sort of a infogram about how we work. We don't provide a lot of the services directly through our office and our budget, but what we do is we connect you to organizations that do. We collaborate with them, and we communicate back to you the services that are available to you. So we're broken up into a few different offices: a business advocacy, which I'm not going to go into for the purpose of this call about what they do, but export promotion, obviously exporters. My unit, small business advocacy. We also have the state planning unit, and the newest sort of group that's joined our team is the Cannabis Training Academy. And what we do is we just provide solutions for your problems. We help you navigate state government and other resources to help provide some solutions. You can always contact us through our call center, 1-800-JERSEY-7. You could also go to the state business website, which is business.nj.gov. We have a live chat on that feature where you ask your questions, and my staff are the ones that will be responding to your questions. And we can also connect you to the Treasury Department if you have a tax issue, or to the Department of Labor for the issues with the employer accounts if you're an employer, as well as the Economic Development Authority for some of their financing and incentive programs. And then our website is below. But we're here to talk about business continuity planning. So the first thing is, what is that, and why should you care about it? Well, I'm going to start with the second question first. Why should you care about it? Well, as I shows on the slide here, FEMA has shown that if a business closes because of a natural disaster, And actually, it's a little further than natural disasters, some other disasters as well, which are, I'll get into defining what a disaster is in a moment. 40% of them will never reopen. And of the ones that do reopen, 25% of those will fail in the first year that they're back in business. So why do you do business continuity planning? Well, you do it because it improves the odds of your business surviving a disaster. All right. So uh, a plan is basically a comprehensive strategy for dealing with a disaster. And I'm not gonna read that whole, formal definition to you. I'm gonna let you read that yourselves. But essentially, what we want to do is put you in a best position to survive a disaster and to recover from that disaster moving forward. And a lot of that has to do with planning your doing some preliminary planning uh, before a disaster occurs. So what are the types of business emergencies or business disasters? Well, the most common disaster a business faces are natural disasters, floods. That is the by far the most common. So a lot of what we're going to talk about today is going to be things that you'll see tend to be more geared towards survival from a flood. And those floods could come from a hurricane or winter storm or a nor'easter or whatever. But they all fall down. Once there's water involved, we're talking about floods. Wind and other things can come from that as well. Then you have your man-made disasters. Those can be accidents. I used to talk about a coffee pot scenario. Now I say the Jake Pearson scenario. For those of you that didn't watch that TV show, I forget the name of it now, but we knew one of the main characters was going to die. We didn't know how. Turns out it was an old crock pot that somebody had given them that had a frayed cord. They plugged it in, caught the house on fire, and the main one of the main characters died. Same thing can happen to your business. Somebody has an old coffee pot that they're making coffee in your business and leave it on overnight or over the weekend. The next thing you know, your building's gone. So that's a disaster that would be man-made. Terrorism. When I first started doing these speeches, was many, many years ago, not long after 9/11. And all anybody ever wanted to talk about at that time was, how do I survive a terrorist attack? How do I put plastic on my windows and have gas masks in my office? Because we always think about the last disaster. Later on, we had Superstorm Sandy. We got to sort of the real threat, which was floods during that time. And of course, we just had a pandemic, which also had an impact on businesses. So we just need to break a habit of talking about the last disaster and making sure we're planning for any kind of disaster. Cybersecurity breaches. I am not a cybersecurity expert, but I'm going to mention that a little bit as we go through this about some of the very, very, very basics of it. Because really what I'm talking about today is really going to be about your planning for these things. And that is going to be dependent on your business. And we'll get into that a little bit more. Health emergencies. Obviously, like I said, the last disaster that most of us face was the pandemic. By the way, it wasn't the last disaster, the pandemic. We had some flooding in Asbury Park, for example, a few months ago. I remember exactly when it was, when the lake actually overflowed and flooded some businesses. I know one that had a $500,000 worth of damage to the business, and they've decided to close permanently. Just as I mentioned in my first slide, 40% of businesses that are affected by a disaster never reopen. And then you have one that people don't necessarily think about, and that's infrastructure failures. I was helping a business rather, actually it was a community, businesses that are going to be for several months. A major artery into their town is going to be closed. It's a bridge that's under repair, and it's going to restrict not necessarily their customer base, but the other issue they have is they have a lot of employees that cross that bridge to come to work every day. And now they're going to have to add a significant amount of time to their commute in order to get to work. So it doesn't have, when you get into these kinds of business disasters, They don't necessarily have to be directly affecting you. They can be indirectly affecting you by creating a problem for your workforce or your supply chain. I used to go to I take care of an elderly family member's swimming pool in the summer. I help them out by going over there, taking care of the chemicals, vacuuming it, that kind of thing. My own little private pool service company, because they won't pay for one. Where I've been buying chemicals for the pool for the last, oh God, 15 years probably. A couple of years ago, guess what? They have a private label pool chemicals, private label chlorine. The plant that makes that for them burned down. So they spent an entire summer with very, very limited supply of pool chemicals. I started to go to a different place to get my chemicals. I still needed the chemicals. And one of the things that you need to consider when you're talking about natural disasters and why you want to get up and running as quickly as you can, and why you want to communicate with your customers, and why do you want to continue to build relationships, which we'll talk a little bit about in a minute, because I have not gone back to them the same level as I used to, because I started going to a different place. My brand loyalty changed. I ended up buying certain products there at the new place now instead of going back to the place I was going to. And that sort of changed my buying habits. So it's not just the loss of the a breakdown in the supply chain. It's that loss of customers, because even though they may have been loyal to you in the past, because they were forced to go somewhere else, you may have broken that connection of loyalty to your business. So it's very important to understand that. And the other one I'm highlighting here is because had a specifically interest in this, with the loss of key personnel. And I'll talk about that a little bit later in my presentation. But that also can be a disaster, especially if that's for example, a partner. And you have that may cause a great disruption in your business if suddenly your partner who is contributing to that business, now who's that person's heir? Who are you going to be dealing with now? Is it a wife? Is it a child? Is it someone else? How does that work? And we'll talk a little bit about that. So the main piece of this I want to emphasize is there is no prescription for good business continuity planning. There's no, I can't go to the library, pull down a copy of a business continuity plan and take it home. It doesn't work that way. You really have to be specific to your industry and specific to your particular business. So the first thing is to do a risk assessment. What is, what is my risk? So I used to have a joke. I used to say, do not plan for a volcanic eruption, which is going to have hot lava flowing down the street in front of your building. Why? Because that doesn't happen in New Jersey. We don't have any active volcanoes. You probably don't have to worry about earthquakes. Yes, we had an earthquake not a few years ago. I remember it well. But it was, I used to joke, it knocked over a chair in my backyard. It's very mild. We don't have that. So what are the risks that we have? We have floods. We have street closings. We have key personnel leaving. And we do have we are vulnerable to cyber attacks. So plan for the risks that are involved, and then assess your business on those risks. And I'm using some technical terms here, which business impact analysis. What if you had a flood? How would that impact your business? If we had a pandemic, another pandemic, we all know how that impacted your business in the past, but how could you do a better job of being prepared in the future? That's what business impact analysis is about, is identifying the risks that your business has. And one of the key pieces to that is identifying the core activities of your business and preparing for them. Here's how I'm going to give you an example, and then I'll talk to you about, sort of how this all works. So I have a friend who's a restaurant owner. He went and bought, after the pandemic had closed down the restaurant, and they were doing a lot of they were doing a lot of uh, takeout, but they had a power outage. And this is the difference between how things change. They had a power outage. They lost the refrigeration in their building. They had to throw out all their cold food supply, all their meats, all their dairy, everything that was in the refrigerator. They threw out. Power came back on. It was off for about a week. I forget what the issue was. Power came back on. They ran out to their supplier, restocked everything. 12 hours later, it went back out again, and they lost everything again. So if you have critical inventory and maybe it needs refrigeration, is it maybe it's worth the investment of installing gas powered generators to run those critical pieces of your business during a power outage or during a hurricane or a flood where power gets knocked out. My power is out for what 2.5 weeks or something after Superstorm Sandy in my house. So that's where I mean about identifying key elements of your business. I used to be a purchasing agent for a company, and we had a product that we used to purchase from Norway. It used to have to be imported. And so I was always concerned about supply chain and the availability of that. What would happen if, like, we had a couple of years ago where a volcanic eruption in Iceland stopped a lot of air traffic. This stuff was heavy. It didn't come in by air. It came in by ship. But what would have happened if that happened? So we found a warehouse that carried the same similar products that was out of Canada. So in an emergency, we could order some materials from there so that we didn't have a disruption in our business operations. That's what I mean by business impact analysis. You've got to figure out what if the entire thing is a what if thing. What if the power went out? What if the road construction happened? What if we have a pandemic? What if customers can't come into our building and we need to have an e-commerce system, which I'm not going to talk about a lot here because I think we all went through this during the pandemic, setting up an e-commerce platform so that you can continue to operate your business, even though the road construction is making it more difficult for your customers to come there, or a pandemic is forcing you to close the doors and go all e-commerce. So there are some things you can do to mitigate any issues, and then you have to develop the plan to respond to those issues and to prepare yourself. And we'll get into a little bit more detail on that as well. The next thing is the mitigation. The disaster is here. It's coming. It's already here. It's actually happening. The storm is predicted, or the pandemic has been declared. What do you do next? And that's where you talk. What do you do now, rather, that it's happening? And that's the mitigation. And so, what is the protocols for responding to the current crisis? The hope is that you've already done the what ifs in your planning phase so that you know how to respond to the disaster. And again, we'll talk a little bit about some of those things in a moment. And then what do you do afterwards? How do you recover once the event has ended and now you're in the recovery stage? So the first thing is to create the plan. So again, you have to be customized to your specific needs, your budget, and your circumstances. Everything doesn't have to be done at once. So I mentioned before about putting in a generator. Well, maybe that's something in your plan, but it's kind of like in a lower priority because of the nature of your business. You don't have to budget to implement the plan all in one budget cycle. You could decide that these are my top 3 priorities. These are my next 3 priorities. I'm going to do these first, then I'm going to do these. So you can implement this over the course of time, depending on your budgetary limitations. But you do want to work with your key personnel. Your key employees should be part of a team to develop this plan for a lot of reasons. One, the more heads, the more brainstorming you do, the better solutions you'll come up with. But you may also have a situation where your employee knows about critical aspects of your business that maybe you didn't think of. They're aware that if they don't have power running to this piece of equipment, at least in a minimal, it's going to cause damage, or they may have some insights that you don't have. And then you need to look at all the different scenarios that we've already been talking about. So like I say, flood is the most common. That's why it's always the top of my list, and I'll mention it over and over again. Flooding is the most common. Cybersecurity. I'm not a cybersecurity expert. I don't have IT experience, but I can talk to you a little bit about some of the basics. So some of the basics are going to be, proper password management among your staff, having a written policy that is not part of your business continuity plan, but it's part of your normal protocols. So an IT protocol. Having that IT protocol is what is called for in your plan, but they're two separate things. So proper password management, uh, uh, using two-factor authentication when possible, um, doing having policies about handling phishing attacks. Phishing attack is when someone sends you an email that looks like it's coming from Facebook, or we're getting those. I'm using Facebook because actually getting these on our chat. People are coming in saying your Facebook account is about to be disabled unless you contact us with this information. What they're really doing is they're trying to capture personal identification, personal ID, personal identifying information from me by claiming to be from Facebook, when they're really just trying to get that information so they can either use that as a way to do a cyber attack, or to do a identity theft. So you want to look out for phishing attacks. You want to look at, how do I deal with a ransomware attack? So work with your IT professionals to talk about the methods you can do that. And of course, the one that goes without saying, because we've been talking about for 25 years, and that is having the proper virus scanning software, that kind of thing. But you want to take that very seriously, because it can be very expensive to deal with afterwards. And you're not going to get a state of emergency declared by the president and get FEMA money and SBA money to deal with the disaster, because it's going to be a disaster that's only focused on your business. So that's not going to happen. So you want to make sure you're prepared for that. Again, pandemic preparedness, and then all the weather related preparedness. Those are all that's just a sample of some scenarios. Oh, and the one we talked about before, key personnel. What happens there? Well, cross training is important, making sure that there are other people in your organization that can handle the core responsibilities of that position. So you don't have to worry about things that are not really that can be delayed for a little while you're waiting to replace a key member of your personnel. But you don't want to have certain whatever those functions are that are truly important not covered by an alternate member, an alternate employee. And that's going to be up to you to make sure that training takes place. But I'm going to give you a scenario, which is something I alluded to before. But and again, this is not a prescription for how to deal with this, but it is a common way for a partner. So you have an LLC and you have multi-members. You have a member that contributes to the company on a regular basis, that is, or you have a partnership, the same situation, a partner. So in your operating agreement or your partnership agreement, you talk about succession planning. And what happens if that partner was to pass away, for example? So I have a partner that dies. Do I want their heir to be part of my company now, because they now own those shares of stock, or that partnership agreement, the partnership, or the ownership interest in the LLC? Do I want them as a partner? And maybe I do, and that would be great. That's fine. However, what you can do is, a common way to deal with this is that the company takes out life insurance policies on each of the partners that is equivalent to the ownership interest, the value of the ownership interest that that person has, the payout. And if that person dies, then in the operating agreement or the partnership agreement, you use the proceeds from that life insurance policy to buy back the shares from the estate. The estate is obligated under the agreement to sell those shares back to the current owners at a fair market price. And that insurance policy creates the funds for you to buy back those that ownership. So that's one way to deal with a core personnel who happens to be an owner. You buy out their heir. Their heir is made whole because they get the market value of the ownership interest. The company survives because you don't have a drawn out conflict with an heir that has an idea about how to run the company that's different than your own, and the business can continue on without harming the heirs of for the deceased partner. So again, that's not prescriptive. I'm not telling you that's the way you should handle that, but that is a way that somebody who has handled this in the past have done that. So that's one way to deal with the death of an owner. But then, like I say, key personnel can also, you can also have the same issue. You do some cross training. You make sure that there's someone in the wings to replace that person if you were to lose them. And it doesn't have to be as dire as a death. I mean, that's always the one that I speak about. Maybe it's my dark sense of my dark personality, but it could be just simply as the person, um, you know, like again, another friend of mine who went to the Virgin Islands, saw a business opportunity and never came back. Said, "I'm buying this business. I'm staying here in the sun." He lived in Vermont. I'm not going back to Vermont where I have to fight the snow all winter. So he left his job and went down there. So it could be a positive reason why they left, but it's not. It still affects your business. Um, so again, define those critical operations for your business and make sure that your plan reflects those critical operations. Um, so some of the basics: inspect your building, look for worn damages, leaking roofs, leaking doors, windows that should be replaced. Maintain your business and your equipment so that a disaster isn't multiplied by your poor preparedness. Move any inventory or equipment above the base flood elevation. What that means is it, there's the engineers create a base flood elevation, which 99% of the time, any floods would not exceed that. So only 1% of floods will go above that base elevation. I worked with a company who was in a flood zone, gave up their flood insurance because they owned their building and decided they didn't need it because the mortgage company wasn't forcing them to get it. They had a flood. Their inventory was on the ground instead of being elevated. It was an electronics company. All of that inventory was destroyed. And what really frustrated me, because they couldn't get any assistance, because it was a localized, so there was no emergency declaration by the president, and they thought their insurance would cover it, but they didn't have flood insurance, and general liability insurance does not cover floods. So they were trying to argue that it was wind. The wind blew the water into my building. That's still a flood. But because they were covered for wind damage. But they were they had got what frustrated me was that they had gotten good advice by a lot of people, and they ignored it because they didn't think it was you know they were arrogant. They decided that they didn't need it. They had state municipal inspectors who I spoke to who said, "Look, I've been in that building a dozen times, and I kept telling him, you got to get this stuff up off the floor. You're in a flood zone. You got to get this up off. You got to get it raised up." And they wouldn't listen to him. And he ended up losing his shirt. And that's because, like I said, again, floods, especially if you're in a flood zone, BFE is something you should know, and you can get that information from some of your professionals. They can calculate your base flood elevation. Um, Insurance. I just mentioned uh, flood insurance. If you're in a flood zone, get flood insurance. I know it can be expensive. I know that people, think that they shouldn't have to have it, that the government's going to step in and fix everything. Absolutely not true. Like I just mentioned, there was a flood recently in Asbury Park. I happen to know of one venue that in Asbury Park that is closed now permanently because it wasn't large enough to get an emergency declaration from the president, which is what really frees up all of the assets to give to businesses that have been affected by a disaster. So now they have $500,000 worth of damage, and they've decided not to go for it. I don't know if they had flood insurance, but that would have been key for them to get through this. But also talk about things like business interruption insurance. And I tell you how many companies don't have that. And that's a key. It's your protects you from the economic damage of reduction in your business because of a natural disaster, which is not covered by your typical insurance. Your typical insurance covers the damage that was done to your building. Doesn't pay for you for the customers that didn't come through your door. That's what business interruption insurance. And yes, during a natural disaster, we have EIDL loans, economic injury disaster loans, but those are loans, not insurance coverage. And a lot of businesses had a big surprise when after the disaster was over and they had to start repaying those loans. And the SBA will work with you on that, but it can cause you an economic injury down the road because now you have to start repaying the loan. For insurance coverage, you're paying for it up front. So therefore, that's not the problem. So business interruption insurance, everyone should discuss that with your insurance agent. This is like the typical disaster supply kit that you should have on hand. Because again, you don't always have foreknowledge of a disaster. Sometimes it happens during business hours. So you should keep a little disaster supply kit. I'm not going to go over all of this. It's basically common sense and it's available. This list and lists like this are available all over the place. Maintain emergency contacts. Uh, uh, that should be for your employers, your suppliers, because if you're expecting a big delivery next month and you have a localized flood, you may want to call your supplier and say, don't make that delivery, hold off. And this is when I expect to be reopened. You can deliver it then. And the same thing with your customers. Key to not losing those customers, like I mentioned before, a business that lost me as a customer because of a disaster, which, like I say, that can happen to you. So communicate with your customer. If you have a delivery that you're supposed to be making, you're not going to make that delivery, contact them, explain to them why, give them a reasonable time frame of when you might be able to make that delivery, or help them find the product another way that you're trying to sell them so that you continue to build that loyalty. They understand that you're doing what you can to make sure you satisfy their need instead of just saying, sorry, you're on your own. I got a disaster to worry about. I'm going to take care of it. But in the long term, you want to be able to uh, keep them as a customer after the disaster. And that's why, again, 25% of besides the 40 that never reopened close in a year. It's one of the ways you can avoid that, maintaining a good relationship with your customer base. And the communication needs to be two-way. Here's what I mean by that. This is a little before cell phones were as popular as they are now, but Hurricane Katrina going into New Orleans, there was a business, I won't mention who it was, that did almost everything right. The building was on higher ground, so the building was not flooded, stayed dry through the whole thing. They maintained contacts with their sort of their network of there was service. They provided a service, but maintained contact with everyone. They had a list of all their employees. They reached out to their employees to tell them that building is fine. We're ready to open back up. But guess what? They couldn't get a hold of anybody because they had home phone numbers for their employees. And during the storm, the employees' homes were gone. They were in shelters. Some of them had in shelters out of state. They had no way to reach any of them. Like I say, that might be a little different now with cell phones, but you should always have a two-way communication system set up. So you have your employees know what the emergency contact number is to reach back out to get information about their jobs and the condition of the business and what needs to happen, what's going to happen in moving forward. So make sure that communication is two-way. And this is where, as you're putting together your plan, this is, like I say, it's a lot of a brainstorming and what ifs. What if this happened? What if that happened? So you want to make sure that you have that kind of communication, and make sure that they have a way to reach you, your customers have a way to reach you, your suppliers have a way to reach you. Now we're, again, I've been doing these a long time. We're in the phase now where you can do things like work with social media platforms to help you do that two-way communication. So there are opportunities there for you to use new technology. And then, you know, I used to tell people you have to keep backups of all of your files, at least 50 miles away from your business. So on a regular basis, taking them there so that if the flood is, I mean, if the disaster is widespread, you don't lose valuable documents and backups of files and things like that. We're in a new world now. You can do this all in the cloud. Make sure you put everything up into the cloud, your contact information, your financial documents, insurance policies, any relevant document, list of inventory with pictures, because when you go to make a claim, it's going to make it a lot easier if you have documentation of when you bought something, how much you paid for it, and the pictures of its condition today when you go to make your claim. So all of that. And that will ask, and the contracts that you have that are relevant, your lease, your insurance policy, any other contract that is important. Make sure you keep copies up in the cloud. The other thing is, I'm going to give you another real world example. I worked for a company, our servers went down, and we were a small company, and we used an outside consultant for taking care of our servers. So we get on the phone, get on the phone and call the our consultant to come and fix our servers. Well, guess what? His phone number is on everyone's Outlook calendar, Outlook contact page, and we don't have access to our computers because our servers are down. We actually had no written copy of the guy's telephone number. We have his business card. We put everything up on the computer. So not being able to access that caused us. It didn't cost us a long time. We had back then we still had phone books, so we had to find a phone book in the office and look them up to get their phone number so that we could get them to come out. And we didn't have a cell phone number for the guy, our normal contact there, that kind of thing. But that's an example of what can happen if you don't have this kind of information available to you in an emergency. We're so dependent on our technology that when our technology fails, so there's a cybersecurity attack or some other issue, you don't have a way to access that information through a different means, you're gonna end up having a more complicated life afterwards. So again, that's going to have to be part of your plan. Plan for evacuations. It could be that the building's got a problem and you need to evacuate. So you should have an evacuation plan. You may want to talk to, and that's going to include like a rallying point for all of your staff to go to make sure that that everyone got out of the building safely. And you may want to establish a relationship with a nearby business for a shelter point if it's, for example, an issue where being outside of the building isn't enough, but you need to go into shelter. If it's 10 degrees out, nobody wants to be standing outside waiting for the building to be cleared. So you set up a rallying point that may include sheltering at a nearby location. Your employees should know what they need to do for a disaster. So we anticipate a hurricane, for example. Go and shut off the gas and other utilities if necessary. Make sure everyone in the building knows what their responsibilities are and are trained to do that. Board up the windows, to secure the building, to do whatever it is, and hold drills. Now, some of those drills could be tabletop. You sit around with that team we talked about, putting together your plan, and you run through scenarios. And then as each scenario, you try to throw a monkey wrench into the plan. Well, what happens if we're doing all this and we don't have any power? So how do we deal with that? What happens if we're doing all this and there's some other issue, and you try to run through scenarios and then improve your plan, and then you do drills, and those drills don't necessarily have to be live. You don't have to say evacuate the building, everybody get out. But you run a drill where you say, okay, building's evacuated. Do you know what you're supposed to do? What are you supposed to do? That kind of thing. Um, and then also make again those indirect disasters like supply chain or problems with the customers not being able to get to your building. So have an alternate way of obtaining the inventory that you need when possible. Sometimes it's not possible, especially with consolidation. We had one baby formula company that had to close because of a health reason, and look what happened to the market. We had a disaster. So it can happen that it's out of your control. But if it is out of your control, how can you deal with it the best you can? And then the same thing for I visited a town after Superstorm Sandy. There was one business left in town, and not a single resident. It was a small community on the shore. Not a single resident was in their homes, and this business was open. The only people that were actually shopping there were people like me who were there for a planning session workshop for people recovering from the disaster. Nobody was going to their business because there was no residents there. So how do you deal with that? Pandemic planning. Uh, this has been in my presentation for a while now because we've always had an influenza threat. Now, of course, we all know that it can be other kinds of infections. So I'm not going to go through this. Most of us already know about this. We just did it, but you want to have a coordinator. You want to identify, the issues that you may face. You want to make sure you stay up to date on public health, what the public health authorities are telling you. You should follow those recommendations, despite what the conspiracy theories are telling you. You should, as much as possible, track employees' vaccination statuses. Um, it is controversial. I understand that, but there's nothing illegal about it. You don't need to get into any other health concerns. You don't have to. Uh, it's not a HIPAA violation, but you can because you don't have, as long as you don't share their information with others. But if they voluntarily give you their information about their vaccination status, that's fine. And then make sure you have proper infection control policies, hand sanitizer, facial tissues, proper cleaning procedures, Clorox wipes and all that in your location, and then tell other working locations like teleworking or another alternative location. And if you have a problem in your building that is localized, because that's another thing. A pandemic doesn't have to be a worldwide pandemic like we just had. It could be a local flu outbreak in your facility where you have multiple people in your facility getting sick, which is a disaster because you can't operate if no one's in the building. And if you allow people that are sick to come into the building, they're going to get other people sick. So you need to have a process where you can separate people, let them telework if possible, or make sure that anyone that is sick is not coming into work and isn't being forced to come to work because of your uh, paid sick leave policy. There is a paid sick leave law that you should all be aware of, and if somebody wants to ask me about it, I can answer it. But you want to make sure that they're not coming to work to getting other people sick. You're better off paying them to stay home than to have half your staff out sick at the same time. So always be aware of those kinds of things when it comes to pandemic planning, and that should be part of your thing. So before I go into this, like I say, I've already kind of talked about cybersecurity being a part of this and key employees being a part of this. Again, if you're going to be forced to be closed, you want to engage with your customers more. I know of a dance studio, for example, that was closed during the pandemic that had of course, the kids couldn't come in to learn dance. They were mostly a kid-oriented place as opposed to some adult dance places, which I actually know of as well. So they did things like they did some online stuff where they would go on a Zoom and teach people dance steps so they could learn them in their home. Some of that were they didn't charge. They were trying to just maintain that brand loyalty that people came back to the studio after they reopened. They also had a big parking lot. So they got permission from the town to do a big inflatable movie screen and they invited their customers to come in cars. So they were separated, so there was no pandemic issue. Come in cars and watch a movie with their business community, with their community of customers. And they were doing a lot of different things to engage their customers to keep them coming and loyal to the dance studio. So mitigation, most valuable asset you have is your employees and your customers. Keep them safe. Don't send them into a building that's flooded if they don't know how to properly be safe in that cleanup. Make sure that they get out of it building safely as as opposed to protecting a piece of equipment that you think is so expensive, because their life and safety is more important than a piece of equipment. So that is always your number one priority. Is the most valuable asset you have are your employees and your customers. Keep them safe. All right. And also engage with your Office of Emergency Management. The rules have changed a little bit, but if you have a natural disaster or any disaster that could get a presidential declaration, what happens is FEMA comes into this community and they do an assessment of the damage. And like I say, the rules have changed a little bit recently. But if the businesses, if enough businesses have enough damage, then you may get an emergency declaration that will free up some resources for those businesses. So it's important to communicate with your Office of Emergency Management, know what they're talking about, know what they're asking, reach out to them when you have a problem, let them know what your problem is. We helped a herd of cows during a storm. It wasn't Sandy, but we helped a herd of cows during a storm where they had burned through 3 different generators trying to run their milking machines to milk the cows. And I am a suburbanite. I have no idea what happens when you don't milk a cow, but apparently it's not a good thing. And so we were able to work with their local emergency management that got them a generator so that they could milk the cows and save that herd. There are advantages of doing that. And like I say, the big advantage is proper communication so that they know how to influence the FEMA representatives, making sure that the damage is assessed properly so that hopefully you can get an emergency declaration so that you can get some of those resources. And there's 3 different declarations. There's one for homes, residential properties, one for government entities when a government, overtime for police and first responders and damage to public buildings. And then there's a third piece of that declaration, which is for the businesses. And you could get an emergency declaration that doesn't include all 3. Could only include 1, 2, or the of the others. So you do want to make sure you're communicating with the Office of Emergency Management. Unplug your equipment during a disaster. Make sure any valuable objects, including inventory or equipment, is above the BFE. Secure the building, board up broken windows. You shouldn't have broken windows if you do this properly. Secure the doors. I even know of a restaurant that had these inflatable, they were on a river. They had this inflatable system with sand in the bottom and air and water in the top, and they surrounded their whole building with it. And as the floodwaters rose up, it created an impromptu dam around the building to keep the floodwaters out of their building. Brilliant system. Like I say, I know of a restaurant that used that during a flood on a river and was very successful in mitigating any damage during the disaster. Take pictures of the damage. This is more of an afterwards, but if there's any, when you come back into that building, if there's any issues with structural integrity, make sure you get it inspected by a qualified professional to make sure it's safe. Contact your insurance agent, contact your employees, vendors, and customers. Do not allow, and there's getting more into the recovery stage. Activate your alternate work workplace locations, your teleworking locations. Basically, activate the plan that you've been working on all this time. Repair any damages. Make sure if you're, again, I mentioned this before, and make sure if your employees are going into a damaged facility, that they're properly trained on safety and health concerns. Make sure that they're using proper protective clothing. And you should be providing that. Make sure that there's no, toxins in the area. Standing water can have a lot of bacteria in it. It's not necessarily safe to be walking through it. You also can't see what you're stepping on. You really want to be extremely safety focused when it comes to this. And when necessary, hire a professional. Don't try to clean up something that you're not capable of cleaning it up, or your staff are not capable of cleaning up. Hire a professional to do that, and make sure you're you're acting appropriately when it comes to this. And of course, file your insurance claims. Make sure that you have a professional look at any utilities that you're reinstating. You don't want to turn on the electric when you have issues that may cause somebody to get electrocuted. So you want to make sure that you have a licensed professional review some of your utilities before you turn them back on, and if you're unsure that they're safe. Talk to your customers and suppliers. I already mentioned this. You want to talk to them, tell them what's going on, when your contractual obligations are going to be fulfilled, when you'll expect to start receiving deliveries again from your suppliers, and communicating with your customers about when you plan on being reopened or alternatives to provide for obtaining your goods and services, and then communicate with your employees as well. Let them know when they can come back to work and uh, what your plans are, and find out from them what their plans are. Maybe they're not coming back. Maybe they went out and found another job. And if that's the case, then you need to plan accordingly when it comes to replacing them when you are ready to be back open. So that's my presentation, and I'm interested in questions. But again, I want to just reemphasize the fact that this is not a prescriptive thing. Everything has to be key to what your business does, what the key components of your business, the key parts of your operation, and what assets you need to protect in order to continue to operate. I'm sorry I neglected to put my contact information in here, but I run the call center, so 1-800-Jersey-7 is always an easy way to contact me because it's my staff that will be picking that up. So just reach out to them and tell them that you want to talk to Don, or you can go to the live chat, do the same. But I will give you my telephone number. My direct number is 609-984-9834, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Here are some other resources for you. American Red Cross is great. I started doing these kinds of things in a cooperative deal with the American Red Cross. They had after 9/11, they had put together a grant program or accepted a grant program rather, to do some business continuity training, and I worked with them. The SBA also has some information, and as well as the Federal Emergency Management Agency which is FEMA, we know as FEMA, has a lot of information on preparing for a disaster. So those are other resources that you can access. Another great resource, which I don't have listed here, your public library. People always think I'm 100 years old when I say that, but actually the library, we work closely with the state library, and they work with the local public libraries on providing resources for businesses. So your public library is another resource for information on business continuity planning. All right. And that's it. Like I said, we're here to provide you with solutions. We're here to help. So if you have any questions, just get back to me.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So I'm happy to take any questions that may have come up.
So Donald, I actually don't see any questions in the Q&A box. That was an excellent, super thorough presentation. So it is quite possible that people don't have questions because the presentation was perfect and it really answered a lot of the questions that people might have. I will just say if anyone does have questions, we're available to go through a few of those if you want to drop them into the Q&A box. I did go ahead and put Donald's email into the chat, and we will share his direct contact information in the post-event thank you email, as well as we will share the PDF of his presentation in the post-event thank you email. So you'll get all of that either end of day today or early tomorrow. Okay, I have some comments. Excellent presentation. Thanks for the information. Yeah, so people seem to really like the presentation, Donald. I think it was super thorough. It really checked a lot of the boxes to give people an overview of why you need a plan and what should go into that plan. One question that I did want to ask, oh, okay, and Donald just dropped his phone number into the chat. Perfect, thank you. And I'll put that in the follow-up email. So one question I did want to ask, a lot of the information just in terms of some of the things that happen with buildings specifically seems to speak to business owners who may actually own their building. And I just want to clarify, is a lot of that stuff also applicable to people who are leasing space in someone else's building? Are those things more so that the building owner they're leasing from would do? And if so, are there any questions that people should be aware of that they should be asking in some of these emergency situations, specifically when it comes to like the natural disaster sort of stuff?
Sure. So obviously, it is going to be more complicated if you don't own the building than if you're a tenant, because although some of the things that you should be aware of may be responsibility of the tenant, like I mentioned, base flood elevation. Keep making sure your inventory is above that base flood elevation. That you can do without your landlord. But if it's repairs to the building, that kind of thing, then yes, it's going to be something your landlord's going to be responsible for. But here's a very, very important point. You should understand that if that building is damaged, you're not entitled to any benefit from like a FEMA or SBA loan to fix the building. You're just the tenant. You don't own the building. So
Right.
you need to make sure that you have insurance as a tenant, that you have business interruption insurance, that the stuff inside your building is covered. I had many businesses that came to me after Superstorm Sandy, for example, and said, all my actually Superstorm Sandy, the feds got involved, but some of the other disasters that have happened, that everything in my shop got destroyed. I had a guy that was an artist; all his artwork got destroyed, and he wanted to get a benefit for it, and he couldn't because his contents weren't covered by his insurance, only the building, and he didn't own the building, so the benefit went to the landlord. So you really do need to understand what your exposure is. Make sure you talk to your insurance agent. Make sure that they understand your specific situation, and that you have the proper coverage for that. There's an old adage that if you're a business owner, on your cell phone, you should have your attorney, your banker, and your insurance agent on speed dial. They should be number 1, 2, and 3 on your speed dial. I always say add a fourth one, which is the Business Action Center, so we can help you. But that's absolutely true. You should have a local insurance agent that knows you, knows your business, that you can pick up the phone and talk to. It may be quick and easy and cheap to go online and just buy an insurance policy off some website, but without that risk management information that you get from a local agent, it probably isn't really worth it.
No, that was super helpful. Thank you, Donald. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that we were addressing the information for people who are leaseholders. Many of our members and attendees do own their buildings, but many of them are also leasing space in buildings, and definitely wanted to make sure we were speaking to some of the needs that they might have.
Yeah, I appreciate that point because I should have mentioned it when I was talking about insurance, but that's the key is making sure you're covered.
Yep. And Donald makes a great point as well about having certain key numbers on speed dial, including the BAC. And from an insurance standpoint, NRBP has many members who are in the insurance industry. And Donald makes a great point about working with someone who's local, who's familiar with your area, who is familiar with the buildings and your business. And so certainly if any of our attendees today are interested in connecting with insurance providers, you can reach out to us and we can share some of our member contacts with you. We do have a question in the chat from Deidre Viney from Express Employment Professionals. So she had a question pertaining to flat roofs. She has a concern about flat roofs and when it snows, the weight of the snow on the building. And she references, I guess there was an incident with a local Trader Joe's. I'm guessing maybe their building, their roof may have collapsed from snow. But basically, she wants to know from the perspective of a tenant, if she's renting, how can I ensure that the building owner is assisting with that sort of issue if she's leasing space in a flat roof building?
Right. Uh, Before you sign a lease or when it's up for renewal, have your attorney review it and talk to them about that. What does the lease say about a situation like that?
Mm,
You know, typically acts of God are not the landlord's responsibility. But I would argue that a flat roof is a flat roof, and
hmm.
you put enough weight on it, it's going to collapse. But there are some standards and some things that should not happen. And you know, if the trusses holding up that roof, I used to be in the construction business. If the trusses in that roof are not well maintained and they're rotting and there's an issue and repairs aren't being made, then the thing's going to collapse. So you know, you the only way to do that is actually get up there and look with somebody that knows what they're talking about, like a structural engineer. But um, but that's an issue. So when you write your lease, you need, you know, when you sign your lease, you want to make sure that there's something in there that talks a little bit about those kinds of issues, and your attorney can help you do that. Other than that, it's really just a maintenance issue. If you feel that the roof is not being maintained properly, let the landlord know. There are some circumstances where people go up and, you know, make sure they shovel off the roof to make sure things like that don't happen. But even the best maintained buildings, it can happen. So again, you want to just be prepared for that. Is one of the scenarios that you may have to face
Hmm.
that we talked about that you'll need to prepare for, and that's going to be insurance, alternate locations. Are there ways to mitigate damage if the roof were to collapse, and how do you keep, you know, insist that the building be maintained properly so it doesn't collapse in the first
Got it. Thank you, Donald. So I think we are all set. I don't see any additional questions. And like I said, I think your presentation was really thorough and to the point with a lot of things. So we're definitely going to share that in the post-event thank you email. I will say if there are any additional questions that people have following the event, you're welcome to send those to me and I can forward those over to Donald and have him follow up with you directly. And we'll also share Donald's contact information. So with that, we are going to wrap up. We thank you all for joining us this morning and attending this webinar. The recording of this will be shared in the post-event thank you email and will be available on our website and on our YouTube channel. So you'll be able to revisit this and share with colleagues who may not have been able to join the program. And just a quick note about NRBP and business planning going into the new year. Many of you here today are members of NRBP, and if that is the case, we encourage you to reach out to us to have your member care call going into the new year so we can discuss ways that we can be helpful to some of the work that you're doing. And if you're not a member, we certainly encourage you to connect with us and learn about the benefits of membership and the way that we can be helpful. I invite you all to join us next Tuesday, December 5th for our end of year holiday reception, NRBP's Toast to Doing Business, which will be held at the Newark Museum of Art from 5 to 7 p.m. And you can find more information about that at newarkrbp.org, our website, and also in the post-event thank you email. So with that, we wish everybody a great day and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.